So on the previous slide, we started framing out the two sides of the issue of standardization of metadata. Basically, it has to do with the tension between an organization adopting a fully standardized metadata schema and accepting all of its elements and rules versus organizations creating customized metadata schemas and coming up with their own elements and rules for formatting and populating those schemas. So it's standardization versus specialization, and each one has pros and cons. If you think of these two as the polar ends of a spectrum, then the best case scenario probably entails finding something in the middle. Dublin Core attempts to land somewhere in the middle by having the core standardized elements, but then allowing for some specialization within each organization that adopts the Dublin Core. And although it may be slightly flawed on some accounts, this has been a widely accepted and heralded approach. There are hundreds or thousands of organizations that have taken on Dublin Core, and it seems to have a good deal of success. And I think it is this, it is the fact that it has done such a good job of striking that balance between standardization and specialization that the Dublin Core is considered a success. So let's look a little bit through some pros and cons of standardization. And since standardization and specialization are the two ends of a spectrum, you could think of pros of standardization as being sort of arguments against creating specialized metadata schemas, and the cons of standardization could be thought of as pros for specialization. So just sort of keep that in mind as we talk through these. So under pros of standardization, we have first predictability. That just means that when a metadata schema is standardized, then the people who are the end users of a system that uses that metadata schema and the people who are catalogers and information professionals that use that schema have a reasonable expectation of what they're going to be able to get with that schema because they're already familiar with it. Comparability just has to do with different it falls in sort of with that predictability criterion. Comparability just makes it possible for end users and for information organizations to be able to compare their holdings, to compare the characteristics of their information resources. When they're all labeled the same way, it's much easier to compare things. And, you know, it's sort of the old apples and oranges kind of debate. When you have two different organizations using the same metadata schema, you have apples and apples rather than apples and oranges. With compatibility, that more has to do with being able to share their digitized records. So compatibility usually has to do with the technical format of the records and the ability of the records to be able to be shared among different organizations. And if you aren't familiar with OCLC, it's probably something that you should look into just to be sort of aware of. It's a really huge and important organization in the library and information science field, and OCLC is completely constructed on this idea of shared cataloging and compatibility of records. It was originally founded in Ohio, and it just made it possible for libraries to share their cataloging so that, you know, when you have like so many thousands of libraries around the world, every time, you know, each of those thousands of libraries gets the same book in its collection, it just doesn't make sense for everybody to catalog the book from top to bottom, soup to nuts, all by themselves. So instead, libraries can enroll in the OCLC program and then start shared cataloging. When a library gets a new book in its collection, it can see if an OCLC record has been created yet, and if it has, then maybe they can even enhance the cataloging by adding some, you know, some details that nobody added in there yet, or filling out some fields. So when you have records like MARC records, which are machine readable and they're formatted, they have the right syntax to be exchangeable through computer networks, then you have this compatibility criterion that you can check off. Now, the cost and initial effort of employing a standardized metadata schema, anytime you're applying a new metadata schema and changing radically the way that cataloging happens in an organization. You're looking at cost, a lot of cost and initial effort, but it's going to be much less when you're using a standardized metadata scheme than when you're doing a specialized one. Just because with a standardized metadata schema, it's already ready to go. It comes to you sort of shrink wrap. You take it out of the box, you've got your template, and you start filling it out. Of course, you do some training to be able to do that correctly. But that's the gist of it. But when you're doing a specialized metadata schema, before you can even start cataloging using the schema, you have to go through all that back effort of creating the schema and identifying what the elements are going to be, and then deciding how each element is going to be properly filled out. And so forth, which can end up being a huge cost and could end up being the final deciding factor for an organization that was trying to decide whether to standardize or specialize. Now, sounds like a pretty hard sell for standardization, right? Well, let's look at some of the cons of standardization. And to me, the pros of standardization seem to fall more under that sort of practicality dimension that I talked about a couple of slides ago, whereas the cons of standardization have more are more in the realm of the principle dimension that was in the answering question slides, which I think is 2 slides back in the previous YouTube section. Anyway, cons of standardization I think can be summed up by borrowing a concept from Skimp of self-perpetuating schemas. And remember what Skimp said about self-perpetuating schemas. Basically, in our cognitive system, we have individual concepts, and then we organize them into schemas when we see relationships recurring among certain concepts over and over again. So you have a schema for a sales transaction. I think we've used that example before. Now, when you have an existing schema, like a metadata schema, that's already organized, then when you have a new kind of information resource, or even a long existing information resource, but that has a characteristic that can't currently be cataloged using the standardized metadata schema, then you either have to force that characteristic or force that information into the schema somewhere that it doesn't belong, or you don't get to record that information at all. For instance, you might have a library that for whatever reason, it makes sense to them to record the color of book covers in their library. Now, if you're using ISBD, which is the the standardized schema for creating library catalog records, there is no element available for the color of a book cover. So they're going to have to find somewhere to force that so that users of their collection can identify that that particular characteristic. Maybe they'll take a metadata element that doesn't get used very often, and they'll just stick the book color information in that element, but that's not a very satisfying solution to the problem. So that's what the orphans and shoehorning thing is all about. Also, if we think about that ontology concept from a couple of sessions ago, standardized metadata schemas do come with some ontological baggage. They have a worldview. They have a list of characteristics that are expressible about books, and you just have to take that at face value and adopt that ontology if you do want to adopt all the benefits of that standardized metadata schema. Finally, the difficulty of mapping to a new system. Once you adopt a standardized metadata schema, you are really committed to sort of sticking with that schema. It's going to be hard to get out of it. It's not easy to change one way or the other, but it would be more difficult to go from standardized to specialized than it would be to go from specialized to standardized. Okay, so here we are at the end of our presentation. This slide's called Metadata and Relevance Criteria. And it's one piddly little slide that has one piddly little main bullet point, but it really is a big sort of take-home message that hopefully ties some things together. We talked a few weeks or a few sessions ago about relevance criteria and how those are the individual characteristics of an information resource that people use to identify their decision about the usefulness of a resource for their information needs. Um, there is an inextricable relationship between metadata and relevance criteria. Basically, if there was no such thing as relevance criteria, there would be no such thing as descriptive metadata. I will say that this, this sort of synthesis that we're talking about in this slide doesn't really apply to administrative metadata or even to structural metadata, just because those serve the more practical purposes of allowing users and information professionals to manage and view and navigate the information resources. But when we talk about the heart of an information system, which has to do with finding and selecting useful information resources, we're talking about using descriptive metadata, and that's what people are going to be searching, and that's what people are going to be looking at when they look at the results of a search and try to decide whether the individual items in a results set are applicable to the information need. So descriptive metadata are for search and relevance assessment. The terms of a search are matched against metadata elements, and you've all seen databases where you can do field-specific searching. That's true even more so. You're specifying which metadata element you want your criterion to be compared with. Information in metadata records that's returned as search results gives, hopefully, gives the user enough information to decide whether or not the resource is relevant. So I see a really tight relationship, I'll say it again, between relevance criteria and descriptive metadata. And the next activity you do is going to invite you to look into sort of building some of those bridges for yourself. And I hope that you'll do the activity and then sort of share how that worked out for you on the message boards for activity number 2. So I'll see everyone on the message boards. Your midterm will be coming to you at 5:30 on Thursday, July 26th. And as always, I'm available for questions about any of the information in this lecture or about the class in general. Okay, bye-bye.